The Mussulman families, being unable to buy back their captive relatives, then offered to exchange them for a much larger number of black Africans, whom it was only too easy to carry off. The offer was accepted by the Portuguese, who found that exchange to their advantage, and thus the slave trade was founded in Europe. Toward the end of the 16th century, this odious traffic was generally admitted, and it was not repugnant to the still barbarous manners. All the states protected it so as to colonize more rapidly and more surely the isles of the New World. In fact, the slaves of black origin could resist the climate, where the badly acclimated whites, still unfit to support the heat of intertropical climates, would have perished by thousands. The transport of Negroes to the American colonies was then carried on regularly by special vessels, and this branch of transatlantic commerce led to the creation of important stations on different points of the African coast. The merchandise cost little in the country of production, and the returns were considerable. But necessary as was the foundation of the colonies beyond the sea from all points of view, it could not justify those markets for human flesh. Generous voices soon made themselves heard, which protested against the trade in blacks and demanded from the European governments a decree of abolition in the name of the principles of humanity. In 1751, the Quakers put themselves at the head of the abolition movement, even in the heart of that North America where, 100 years later, the War of Secession was to burst forth, to which this question of slavery was not a foreign one. Different states in the North, Virginia, Connecticut, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, decreed the abolition of the slave trade and freed the slaves brought to their territories at great expense. But the campaign commenced by the Quakers did not limit itself to the northern provinces of the New World. Slaveholders were warmly attacked beyond the Atlantic. France and England, more particularly, recruited partisans for this just cause. Let the colonies perish rather than a principle. Such was the generous command which resounded through all the Old World, and in spite of the great political and commercial interests engaged in the question, it was effectively transmitted through Europe. The impetus was given. In 1807, England abolished the slave trade in her colonies, and France followed her example in 1814. The two powerful nations exchanged a treaty on this subject, a treaty confirmed by Napoleon during the Hundred Days. However, that was as yet only a purely theoretical declaration. The slave ships did not cease to cross the seas and to dispose of their ebony cargoes in colonial ports. More practical measures must be taken in order to put an end to this commerce. The United States in 1820 and England in 1824 declared the slave trade an act of piracy, and those who practiced it pirates. As such, they drew on themselves the penalty of death, and they were pursued to the end. France soon adhered to the new treaty, but the states of South America and the Spanish and Portuguese colonies did not join in the act of abolition. The exportation of blacks then continued to their profit, notwithstanding the right of search generally recognized, which was limited to the verification of the flag of suspicious vessels. Meanwhile, the new law of abolition had not a retroactive effect. No more new slaves were made, but the old ones had not yet recovered their liberty. It was under those circumstances that England set an example. In May 1833, a general declaration emancipated all the blacks in the colonies of Great Britain, and in August 1838, 670,000 slaves were declared free. 10 years later, in 1848, the Republic emancipated the slaves of the French colonies, say about 260,000 blacks. In 1861, the war which broke out between the Federals and Confederates of the United States, finishing the work of emancipation, extended it to all North America. The three great powers had then accomplished this work of humanity. At the present hour, the trade is no longer carried on, except for the benefit of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies, and to satisfy the wants of the populations of the Orient, Turks, or Arabs. Brazil, if she has not yet restored her old slaves to liberty, at least no longer receives new ones, and the children of the blacks are born free there. It is in the interior of Africa, in the prosecution of those bloody wars, waged by the African chiefs among themselves for this manhunt, that entire tribes are reduced to slavery. Two opposite directions are then given to the caravans, one to the west, toward the Portuguese colony of Angola, the other to the east, on the Mozambique. Of these unfortunate beings, of whom only a small portion arrive at their destination, some are exported, it may be to Cuba, it may be to Madagascar, others to the Arab or Turkish provinces of Asia, to Mecca, or to Muscat. The English and French cruisers can only prevent this traffic to a small extent, as it is so difficult to obtain an effective surveillance over such far extended coasts. But the figures of these odious exportations, are they still considerable? Yes, the number of slaves who arrive at the coast is estimated at not less than 80,000, and this number, it appears, only represents the tenth of natives massacred. After these dreadful butcheries, the devastated fields are deserted, the burnt villages are without inhabitants, the rivers carry down dead bodies, deer occupy the country. Livingstone, the day after one of these men hunts, no longer recognized the provinces he had visited a few months before. All the other travelers, Grant, Speke, Burton, Cameron, and Stanley, do not speak otherwise of this wooded plateau of Central Africa, the principal theater of the wars between the chiefs. In the region of the Great Lakes, over all that vast country which feeds the market of Zanzibar, in Bornu and Fezzan, farther south, on the banks of the Nyassa and the Zambesi, farther west in the districts of the Upper Zaire, which the daring Stanley has just crossed, is seen the same spectacle: ruins, massacres, depopulation. Then will slavery in Africa only end with the disappearance of the black race? And will it be with this race as it is with the Australian race or the race in New Holland? But the market of the Spanish and Portuguese colonies will close someday. That outlet will be wanting. Civilized nations can no longer tolerate the slave trade. Yes, without doubt. And this year even, 1878, ought to see the enfranchisement of all the slaves still possessed by Christian states. However, for long years to come, the Mussulman nations will maintain this traffic, which depopulates the African continent. It is for them, in fact, that the most important emigration of the blacks is made, as the number of natives snatched from their provinces and brought to the eastern coast annually exceeds 40,000. Long before the expedition to Egypt, the Negroes of the Sunar were sold by thousands to the Negroes of the Darfur, and reciprocally. General Bonaparte was able to buy a pretty large number of these blacks, of whom he made organized soldiers like the Mamelukes. Since then, during this century, of which 4/5 have now passed away, commerce in slaves has not diminished in Africa. On the contrary. And in fact, Islamism is favorable to the slave trade. The black slave must replace the white slave of former times, in Turkish provinces. So contractors of every origin pursue this execrable traffic on a large scale. They thus carry a supplement of population to those races, which are dying out and will disappear someday, because they do not regenerate themselves by labor. These slaves, as in the time of Bonaparte, often become soldiers. With certain nations of the Upper Niger, they compose the half of the armies of the African chiefs. Under these circumstances, their fate is not sensibly inferior to that of free men. Besides, when the slave is not a soldier, he is money which has circulation. Even in Egypt and at Bornu, officers and functionaries are paid in that money. William Legian has seen it and has told of it. Such is, then, the actual state of the trade. Must it be added that a number of agents of the great European powers are not ashamed to show a deplorable indulgence for this commerce? Nevertheless, nothing is truer. While the cruisers watch the coasts of the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans, the traffic goes on regularly in the interior, the caravans walk on under the eyes of certain functionaries, and massacres, where 10 blacks perish to furnish one slave, take place at stated periods. So, it will now be understood how terrible were those words just pronounced by Dick Sand. Africa, equatorial Africa, Africa of slave traders and slaves. And he was not deceived. It was Africa with all its dangers, for his companions and for himself. But on what part of the African continent had an inexplicable fatality landed him? Evidently on the western coast, and as an aggravating circumstance, the young novice was forced to think that the Pilgrim was thrown on precisely that part of the coast of Angola where the caravans, which clear all that part of Africa, arrive. In fact, it was there, it was that country which Cameron on the south and Stanley on the north were going to cross a few years later, and at the price of what efforts? Of this vast territory, which is composed of 3 provinces, Benguela, Congo, and Angola, there was but little known then except the coast. It extends from the Nurse in the south as far as the Zaire in the north, and the 2 principal towns form 2 ports, Benguela and St. Paul de Londa, the capital of the colony which set off from the Kingdom of Portugal. The interior of this country was then almost unknown. Few travelers had dared to venture there. A pernicious climate, warm and damp lands, which engender fevers, barbarous natives, some of whom are still cannibals, a permanent state of war between tribes, the slave traders' suspicion of every stranger who seeks to discover the secrets of their infamous commerce. Such are the difficulties to surmount, the dangers to overcome in this province of Angola, one of the most dangerous of equatorial Africa. Tucky, in 1816, had ascended the Congo beyond the Yalala Falls, but over an extent of 200 miles at the most. This simple halting place could not give a definite knowledge of the country, and nevertheless, it had caused the death of the greater part of the savants and officers who composed the expedition. 37 years later, Dr. Livingstone had advanced from the Cape of Good Hope as far as the upper Zambesi. Thence, in the month of November, with a hardihood which has never been surpassed, he traversed Africa from the south to the northwest, cleared the Congo, one of the branches of the Congo, and on the 31st of May, 1854, arrived at St. Paul de Londa. It was the first view in the unknown of the great Portuguese colony. 18 years after, two daring discoverers crossed Africa from the east to the west, and arrived, one south, the other north of Angola, after unheard of difficulties. The first, according to the date, was a lieutenant in the English Navy, Verne Howitt Cameron. In 1872, there was reason to fear that the expedition of the American, Stanley, was in great danger. It had been sent to the Great Lake region in search of Livingstone. Lieutenant Cameron offered to go over the same road. The offer was accepted. Cameron, accompanied by Dr. Dillon, Lieutenant Cecil Murphy, and Robert Moffat, a nephew of Livingstone, started from Zanzibar. After having crossed Ogogo, he met Livingstone's faithful servants carrying their master's body to the eastern coast. He continued his route to the west, with the unconquerable desire to pass from one coast to the other. He crossed Aunianiemb, Augonda, and Cahuel, where he collected the great traveler's papers. Having passed over Tanganyika and the Bambar Mountains, he reached Lualaba but could not descend its course. After having visited all the provinces devastated by war and depopulated by the slave trade, Kamba, Arwa, the sources of the Lamane, Ulauda, Lowville, and having crossed the Konza and the immense forests in which Harris has just entrapped Dick Sand and his companions, the energetic Cameron finally perceived the Atlantic Ocean and arrived at St. Philip of Benguela. This journey of 3 years and 4 months had cost the lives of his two companions, Dr. Dillon and Robert Moffat. Henry Moreland Stanley, the American, almost immediately succeeded the Englishman, Cameron, on the road of discoveries. We know that this intrepid correspondent of the New York Herald, sent in search of Livingstone, had found him on October 30th, 1871, at Aujiji, on Lake Tanganyika. Having so happily accomplished his object for the sake of humanity, Stanley determined to pursue his journey in the interest of geographical science. His object then was to gain a complete knowledge of Lualaba, of which he had only had a glimpse. Cameron was then lost in the provinces of Central Africa, when, in November 1874, Stanley quitted Bagamoga, on the eastern coast. 21 months after, August 24, 1876, he abandoned Aujiji, which was decimated by an epidemic of smallpox. In 74 days, he effected the passage of the lake at Enyangwe, a great slave market, which had been already visited by Livingstone and Cameron. Here he witnessed the most horrible scenes, practiced in the Marungu and Maniauma countries by the officers of the Sultan of Zanzibar. Stanley then took measures to explore the course of the Lualaba and to descend it as far as its mouth. 140 bearers, engaged at Enyangwe, and 19 boats formed the material and the force of his expedition. From the very start, he had to fight the cannibals of Algosin. From the start, also, he had to attend to the carrying of boats, so as to pass insuperable cataracts. Under the equator, at the point where the Lualaba makes a bend to the northeast, 54 boats, manned by several hundred natives, attacked Stanley's little fleet, which succeeded in putting them to flight. Then the courageous American, rescending as far as the 2nd degree of northern latitude, ascertained that the Lualaba was the upper Zaire, or Congo, and that by following its course he could descend directly to the sea. This he did, fighting nearly every day against the tribes that lived near the river. On June 3d, 1877, at the passage of the cataracts of Masasa, he lost one of his companions, Francis Pocock. July 18th, he was drawn with his boat into the falls of 1,000 below and only escaped death by a miracle. Finally, August 6th, Henry Stanley arrived at the village of Nysanda, 4 days' journey from the coast. 2 days after, at Banza 1,000 Bauco, he found the provisions sent by 2 merchants from Mboma. He finally rested at this little coast town, aged, at 35 years, by overfatigue and privations, after an entire passage of the African continent, which had taken 2 years and 9 months of his life. However, the course of the Lualaba was explored as far as the Atlantic. And if the Nile is the great artery of the north, if the Zambezi is the great artery of the east, we now know that Africa still possesses in the west the third of the largest rivers in the world. A river which, in a course of 2,900 miles, under the names of Lualaba, Zaire, and Congo, unites the lake region with the Atlantic Ocean. However, between these two books of travel, Stanley's and Cameron's, the province of Angola is somewhat better known in this year than in 1873, at that period when the Pilgrim was lost on the African coast. It was well known that it was the seat of the Western slave trade, thanks to its important markets of Bi, Kassenj, and Kazonde. It was into this country that Dick Sand had been drawn, more than 100 miles from the coast, with a woman exhausted by fatigue and grief, a dying child, and some companions of African descent, the prey, as everything indicated, to the rapacity of slave merchants. Yes, it was Africa, and not that America where neither the natives, nor the deer, nor the climate are very formidable. It was not that favorable region, situated between the Cordilleras and the coast, where straggling villages abound, and where missions are hospitably open to all travelers. They were far away, those provinces of Peru and Bolivia, where the tempest would have surely carried the Pilgrim, if a criminal hand had not changed its course, where the shipwrecked ones would have found so many facilities for returning to their country. It was the terrible Angola, not even that part of the coast inspected by the Portuguese authorities, but the interior of the colony, which is crossed by caravans of slaves under the whip of the driver. What did Dick Sand know of this country where treason had thrown him? Very little. What the missionaries of the 16th and 17th centuries had said of it. What the Portuguese merchants, who frequented the road from St. Paul de Londa to the Zaire, by way of San Salvador, knew of it. What Dr. Livingstone had written about it, after his journey of 1853, and that would have been sufficient to overwhelm a soul less strong than his. Truly, the situation was terrible. Chapter 2. Harris and Negoro. The day after that, on which Dick Sand and his companions had established their last halt in the forest, two men met together about 3 miles from there, as it had been previously arranged between them. These two men were Harris and Negoro, and we are going to see now what chance had brought together, on the coast of Angola, the Portuguese come from New Zealand, and the American, whom the business of trader obliged to often traverse this province of Western Africa. Harris and Negoro were seated at the foot of an enormous banyan, on the steep bank of an impetuous stream, which ran between a double hedge of papyrus. The conversation commenced, for the Portuguese and the American had just met, and at first they dwelt on the deeds which had been accomplished during these last hours. "And so, Harris," said Negoro, "you have not been able to draw this little troop of Captain Sand, as they call this novice of 15 years, any farther into Angola." "No, comrade," replied Harris, "and it is even astonishing that I have succeeded in leading him 100 miles at least from the coast. Several days ago my young friend, Dick Sand, looked at me with an anxious air. His suspicions gradually changed into certainties and faith. Another 100 miles, Harris, and those people would be still more surely in our hands. However, they must not escape us." "Ah, how could they?" replied Harris, shrugging his shoulders. "I repeat it, Negoro, there was only time to part company with them. 10 times have I read in my young friend's eyes that he was tempted to send a ball into my breast, and I have too bad a stomach to digest those prunes which weigh a dozen to the pound." "Good," returned Negoro, "I also have an account to settle with this novice." "And you shall settle it at your ease, with interest, comrade. As to me, during the first 3 days of the journey, I succeeded very well in making him take this province for the desert of Atacama, which I visited formerly. But the child claimed his caoutchoucs and his hummingbirds. The mother demanded her quinquinas. The cousin was crazy to find cacuyos. Faith, I was at the end of my imagination, and after with great difficulty making them swallow ostriches for giraffes, a godsend, indeed, Negoro, I no longer knew what to invent. Besides, I well saw that my young friend no longer accepted my explanations. Then we fell on elephants' prints. The hippopotami were added to the party. And you know, Negoro, hippopotami and elephants in America are like honest men in the penitentiaries of Benguela. Finally, to finish me, there was the old black, who must find forks and chains at the foot of a tree. Slaves had freed themselves from them to flee. At the same moment, the lion roared, starting the company, and it is not easy to pass off that roaring for the mewing of an inoffensive cat. I then had only time to spring on my horse and make my way here. I understand, replied Negoro. Nevertheless, I would wish to hold them 100 miles further in the province. One does what he can, comrade, replied Harris. As to you, who followed our caravan from the coast, you have done well to keep your distance. They felt you were there. There is a certain dingo that does not seem to love you. What have you done to that animal? Nothing, replied Negoro, but before long it will receive a ball in the head. As you would have received one from Dick Sand, if you had shown ever so little of your person within 200 feet of his gun. Ah, how well he fires, my young friend, and between you and me, I am obliged to admit that he is, in his way, a fine boy. No matter how fine he is, Harris, he will pay dear for his insolence, replied Negoro, whose countenance expressed implacable cruelty. Good, murmured Harris, my comrade remains just the same as I have always known him. Voyages have not injured him. Then, after a moment's silence, "Ah, there, Negoro," continued he, "when I met you so fortunately there below, at the scene of the shipwreck, at the mouth of the Longa, you only had time to recommend those honest people to me, while begging me to lead them as far as possible across this pretended Bolivia. You have not told me what you have been doing these 2 years. 2 years, comrade, in our chance existence, is a long time. One fine day, after having taken charge of a caravan of slaves on old Alves's account, whose very humble agents we are, you left Cassinge and have not been heard of since. I have thought that you had some disagreement with the English cruiser, and that you were hung. I came very near it, Harris. That will come, Negoro. Thank you. What would you have? Replied Harris with an indifference quite philosophical. It is one of the chances of the trade. We do not carry on the slave trade on the coast of Africa without running the risk of dying elsewhere than in our beds. So, you have been taken? Yes. By the English. No, by the Portuguese. Before or after having delivered your cargo? Asked Harris. After, replied Negoro, who had hesitated a little about replying. These Portuguese now make difficulties. They want no more slavery, though they have used it so long to their profit. I was denounced, watched. They took me. And condemned me to finish my days in the penitentiary of St. Paul de Londa. 1,000 devils, exclaimed Harris. That is an unhealthy place for men accustomed, like us, to live in the open air. As to me, perhaps I should prefer being hung. One does not escape from the gallows, replied Negoro, but from prison. You were able to make your escape. Yes, Harris, only 15 days after being put in prison. I was able to hide myself at the bottom of the hold of an English steamer, sailing for Auckland of New Zealand. A barrel of water and a case of conserves, between which I had intruded, furnished me with food and drink during the whole passage. Oh, I suffered terribly from not being willing to show myself when we were at sea. But if I had been imprudent enough to do it, I would have been confined again at the bottom of the hold, and, voluntarily or not, the torture would be the same. Besides, on my arrival at Auckland, they would have returned me again to the English authorities and finally brought me back to the penitentiary of Londa, or perhaps hung me, as you said. That was why I preferred to travel incognito. And without paying your passage, exclaimed Harris, laughing. Ah, that is not considerate, comrade, to be fed and carried gratis. Yes, returned Negoro, but 30 days' passage at the bottom of the hold. At last that was over, Negoro. You set out for New Zealand in the land of the Maoris, but you have returned. Was the return made under the same circumstances? Not so, Harris. You may well believe that, over there, I had only one idea, to return to Angola and take up my trade of slave trader again. Yes, replied Harris, one loves his trade from habit. For 18 months. Having pronounced those last words, Negoro stopped suddenly. He seized his companion's arm and listened. Harris, said he, lowering his voice, was there not a trembling in that papyrus bush? Yes, indeed, replied Harris, seizing his gun, always ready to fire. Negoro and he stood up, looked around them, and listened with the greatest attention. There is nothing there, said Harris. It is this brook, swelled by the storm, which runs more noisily. For 2 years, comrade, you have been unaccustomed to the noises of the forest, but you will get used to them again. Continue, then, the narration of your adventures. When I understand the past, we shall talk of the future. Negoro and Harris sat down again at the foot of the banyan. The Portuguese continued in these terms. For 18 months I vegetated in Auckland. When the steamer arrived there, I was able to leave it without being seen, but not a piaster, not a dollar in my pocket. In order to live, I had to follow all trades. Even the trade of an honest man, Negoro. As you say, Harris. Poor boy. Now I was always waiting for an opportunity, which was long coming, when the Pilgrim, a whaler, arrived at the port of Auckland. That vessel which went ashore on the coast of Angola. Even the same, Harris, and on which Mrs. Weldon, her child, and her cousin were going to take passage. Now, as an old sailor, having even been second on board a slave ship, I was not out of my element in taking service on a ship. I then presented myself to the Pilgrim's captain, but the crew was made up. Very fortunately for me, the schooner's cook had deserted. Now, he is no sailor who does not know how to cook. I offered myself as head cook. For want of a better, I was accepted. A few days after, the Pilgrim had lost sight of the land of New Zealand. But, asked Harris, according to what my young friend has told me, the Pilgrim did not set sail at all for the coast of Africa. How then has she arrived here? Dick Sand ought not to be able to understand it yet, and perhaps he will never understand it, replied Negoro. But I am going to explain to you what has passed, Harris, and you will be able to tell it again to your young friend, if it pleases you to do so. How then? Replied Harris. Speak, comrade, speak. The Pilgrim, continued Negoro, as on the way to Valparaiso. When I went on board, I only intended to go to Chile. It was always a good half of the way between New Zealand and Angola, and I was drawing nearer Africa's coast by several thousand miles. But it so happened that only 3 weeks after leaving Auckland, Captain Hull, who commanded the Pilgrim, disappeared with all his crew while chasing a whale. On that day, then, only 2 sailors remained on board, the novice and the cook, Negoro. And you took command of the ship? Asked Harris. I had that idea at first, but I saw that they distrusted me. There were live, strong blacks on board, free men. I would not have been the master, and, on reflection, I remained what I was at the departure, the Pilgrim's cook. Then it was chance that led this ship to the coast of Africa. No, Harris, replied Negoro. There has been no chance in all this adventure except meeting you, in one of your journeys, just on that part of the coast where the Pilgrim was wrecked. But as to coming in sight of Angola, it was by my will, my secret will, that was done. Your young friend, still much of a novice in navigation, could only tell his position by means of the log and the compass. Well, one day the log went to the bottom. One night the compass was made false, and the Pilgrim, driven by a violent tempest, took the wrong route. The length of the voyage, inexplicable to Dick Sand, would be the same to the most experienced seaman. Without the novice knowing or even suspecting it, Cape Horn was doubled, but I recognized it in the midst of the fogs. Then, thanks to me, the needle in the compass took its true direction again, and the ship, blown to the northeast by that frightful hurricane, has just been cast on the coast of Africa, just on this land of Angola which I wish to reach. And even at that moment, Negoro, replied Harris, chance had led me there to receive you and guide those honest people to the interior. They believed themselves, they could only believe themselves in America. It was easy for me to make them take this province for Lower Bolivia, to which it has really some resemblance. Yes, they believed it, as your young friend believed they had made the Isle of Pax, when they passed in sight of Tristan da Cunha. Anybody would be deceived by it, Negoro. I know it, Harris, and I even counted on profiting by that error. Finally, behold Mrs. Weldon and her companions 100 miles in the interior of this Africa, where I wanted to bring them. But, replied Harris, they know now where they are. Ah, what matter at present, cried Negoro. And what will you do with them? Asked Harris. What will I do with them? Replied Negoro. Before telling you, Harris, give me news of our master, the slave trader Alves, whom I have not seen for 2 years. Oh, the old rascal is remarkably well, replied Harris, and he will be enchanted to see you again. Is he at the Bih market? Asked Negoro. No, comrade, he has been at his establishment at Kazonde for a year. And business is lively. Yes, 1,000 devils, exclaimed Harris, although the slave trade becomes more and more difficult, at least on this coast. The Portuguese authorities on one side, and the English cruisers on the other, limit exportations. There are few places, except in the environs of Mossames, to the south of Angola, that the shipping of blacks can now be made with any chance of success. So, at this time, the pens are filled with slaves, waiting for the ships which ought to carry them to Spanish colonies. As to passing them by Benguela or St. Paul de Londa, that is not possible. The governors no longer understand reason, no more do the chiefs title given to the Portuguese governors of secondary establishments. We must then return to the factories of the interior. This is what old Alves intends to do. He will go from the Nyangwe and Tanganyika side to change his stuffs for ivory and slaves. Business is always profitable with Upper Egypt and the Mozambique coast, which furnishes all Madagascar. But I fear the time will come when the trade can be no longer carried on. The English are making great progress in the interior of Africa. The missionaries advance and work against us. That Livingstone, curse him, after exploring the lake region, is going, they say, to travel toward Angola. Then they speak of a Lieutenant Cameron, who proposes to cross the continent from east to west. They also fear that the American, Stanley, wishes to do as much. All these visits will end by damaging our operations, Negoro, and if we care for our own interests, not one of those visitors will return to relate in Europe what he has had the indiscretion to come to see in Africa. Would not one say, to hear them, the rascals, that they were speaking like honest merchants whose affairs were momentarily cramped by a commercial crisis? Who would believe that, instead of sacks of coffee or casks of sugar, they were talking of human beings to export like merchandise? These traders have no other idea of right or wrong. The moral sense is entirely lacking in them, and if they had any, how quickly they would lose it among the frightful atrocities of the African slave trade. But where Harris was right was when he said that civilization was gradually penetrating those savage countries in the wake of those hardy travelers, whose names are indissoluble linked to the discoveries of equatorial Africa. At the head, David Livingstone; after him, Grant, Speke, Burton, Cameron, Stanley. Those heroes will leave imperishable names as benefactors of humanity. When their conversation reached that point, Harris knew what the last 2 years of Negoro's life had been. The traitor Alves's old agent, the escaped prisoner from the Londa penitentiary, reappeared the same as Harris had always known him, that is, ready to do anything. But what plan Negoro intended to take in regard to the shipwreck from the Pilgrim, Harris did not yet know. He asked his accomplice about it. "And now," said he, "what are you going to do with those people?" "I shall make two parties of them," replied Negoro, like a man whose plan had been long formed, "those whom I shall sell as slaves and those whom—" The Portuguese did not finish, but his ferocious physiognomy spoke plainly enough. "Which will you sell?" asked Harris. "Those blacks who accompany Mrs. Weldon," replied Negoro. "Old Tom is not perhaps of much value, but the others are 4 strong fellows, who will bring a high price in the Kazon market." "I well believe it, Negoro," replied Harris. "4 Negroes, well-made, accustomed to work, have very little resemblance to those brutes which come to us from the interior. Certainly you will sell them at a high price. Slaves, born in America, and exported to the markets of Angola, that is rare merchandise. But," added the American, "you have not told me if there was any money on board the Pilgrim." "Oh, a few $100s only, which I have succeeded in saving. Fortunately, I count on certain returns." "Which then, comrade?" asked Harris with curiosity. "Nothing," replied Negoro, who appeared to regret having spoken more than he intended. "It now remains to take possession of all that high-priced merchandise," said Harris. "Is it then so difficult?" asked Negoro. "No, comrade. 10 miles from here, on the Konza, a caravan of slaves is encamped, conducted by the Arab Ibn Hamis. He only awaits my return to take the road for Kazond. There are more native soldiers there than are needed to capture Dick Sand and his companions. It will be sufficient for my young friend to conceive the idea of going to the Konza." "But will he get that idea?" asked Negoro. "Surely," replied Harris, "because he is intelligent and cannot suspect the danger that awaits him. Dick Sand would not think of returning to the coast by the way we have followed together. He would be lost among these immense forests. He will seek then, I am sure, to reach one of the rivers that flow toward the coast, so as to descend it on a raft. He has no other plan to take, and I know he will take it." "Yes, perhaps so," replied Negoro, who was reflecting. "It is not perhaps so, it is assuredly so, that must be said," continued Harris. "Do you see, Negoro? It is as if I had appointed a rendezvous with my young friend on the banks of the Konza." "Well then," replied Negoro, "let us go. I know Dick Sand. He will not delay an hour and we must get before him." "Let us start, comrade." Harris and Negoro both stood up, when the noise that had before attracted the Portuguese's attention was renewed. It was a trembling of the stems between the high papyrus. Negoro stopped and seized Harris's hand. Suddenly, a low barking was heard. A dog appeared at the foot of the bank, with its mouth open, ready to spring. "Dingo!" cried Harris. "Ah, this time it shall not escape me," replied Negoro. Dingo was going to jump upon him, when Negoro, seizing Harris's gun, quickly put it to his shoulder and fired. A long howl of pain replied to the detonation, and Dingo disappeared between the double row of bushes that bordered the brook. Negoro descended at once to the bottom of the bank. Drops of blood stained some of the papyrus stems, and a long red track was left on the pebbles of the brook. "At last that cursed animal is paid off," exclaimed Negoro. Harris had been present at this whole scene without saying a word. "Ah now, Negoro," said he, "that dog had a particular grudge against you." "It seemed so, Harris, but it will have a grudge against me no longer." "And why did it detest you so much, comrade?" "Oh, an old affair to settle between it and me." "An old affair," replied Harris. Negoro said no more about it, and Harris concluded that the Portuguese had been silent on some past adventure, but he did not insist on knowing it. A few moments later, both, descending the course of the brook, went toward the Konza, across the forest. Chapter 3. On the March. Africa, that name so terrible under the present circumstances, that name which he must now substitute for that of America, was not for an instant out of Dick Sand's thoughts. When the young novice traced back the last weeks, it was to ask himself how the Pilgrim had ended by reaching this dangerous shore, how it had doubled Cape Horn, and passed from one ocean to the other. He could now explain to himself why, in spite of the rapid motion of his vessel, land was so long coming in sight, because the length of the distance which he should have made to reach the American coast had been doubled without his knowledge. "Africa, Africa," Dick Sand repeated. Then, suddenly, while he called up with tenacious mind all the incidents of this inexplicable voyage, he felt that his compass must have been injured. He remembered, too, that the first compass had been broken, and that the log line had snapped, a fact which had made it impossible for him to establish the speed of the Pilgrim. "Yes," thought he, "there remained but one compass on board, one only, the indications of which I could not control, and one night I was awakened by a cry from old Tom. Negoro was there, aft. He had just fallen on the binnacle. May he not have put it out of order?" Dick Sand was growing enlightened. He had his finger on the truth. He now understood all that was ambiguous in Negoro's conduct. He saw his hand in this chain of incidents which had led to the loss of the Pilgrim and had so fearfully endangered those on board of her. But what, then, was this miserable man? Had he been a sailor and known so well how to hide the fact? Was he capable of contriving this odious plot which had thrown the ship on the coast of Africa? At any rate, if obscure points still existed in the past, the present could offer no more of them. The young novice knew only too well that he was in Africa, and very probably in the fatal province of Angola, more than 100 miles from the coast. He also knew that Harris's treason could no longer be doubted. From this fact, the most simple logic led him to conclude that the American and the Portuguese had long known each other, that a fatal chance had united them on this coast, and that a plan had been concerted between them, the result of which would be dreadful for the survivors of the Pilgrim. And now, why these odious actions? That Negoro wished, at all hazards, to seize Tom and his companions and sell them for slaves in this slave-trading country might be admitted. That the Portuguese, moved by a sentiment of hatred, would seek to be revenged on him, Dick Sand, who had treated him as he deserved, might also be conceived. But Mrs. Weldon, this mother, and this young child, what would the wretch do with them? If Dick Sand could have overheard a little of the conversation between Harris and Negoro, he would have known what to expect and what dangers menaced Mrs. Weldon, the blacks, and himself. The situation was frightful, but the young novice did not yield under it. Captain on board, he remained captain on land. He must save Mrs. Weldon, little Jack, all those whose fate heaven had placed in his hands. His task was only commencing. He would accomplish it to the end. After 2 or 3 hours, during which the present and the future were summed up in his mind, with their good and their evil chances, the last, alas, the most numerous, Dick Sand rose, firm and resolved. The first glimmer of light then touched the summits of the forest. With the exception of the novice and Tom, all slept. Dick Sand approached the old black. "Tom," he said to him, in a low tone, "You have recognized the roaring of the lion, you have remembered the instruments of the slave traders. You know that we are in Africa." "Yes, Mr. Dick, I know it." "Well, Tom, not a word of all that, neither to Mrs. Weldon nor to your companions. We must be the only ones to know, the only ones to have any fears." "Alone, in fact, it is necessary," replied Tom. "Tom," continued the novice, "we have to watch more carefully than ever. We are in an enemy's country, and what enemies? What a country, to keep our companions on their guard. It will be enough to tell them that we have been betrayed by Harris. They will think that we fear an attack from wandering Indians, and that will suffice. You can count absolutely on their courage and devotion, Mr. Dick. I know it as I count on your good sense and your experience. You will come to my help, old Tom. Always and everywhere, Mr. Dick." Dick Sand's plan was accepted and approved by the old black. If Harris were detected in open treason before the hour for action, at least the young novice and his companions were not in fear of any immediate danger. In fact, it was the discovery of the irons abandoned by some slaves, and the roaring of the lion, that had caused the Americans' sudden disappearance. He knew that he was discovered, and he had fled probably before the little party which he guided had reached the place where an attack had been arranged. As for Negoro, whose presence Dingo had certainly recognized during these last days of the march, he must have rejoined Harris so as to consult with him. At any rate, several hours would pass before Dick Sand and his friends would be assailed, and it was necessary to profit by them. The only plan was to regain the coast as quickly as possible. This coast, as the young novice had every reason to believe, was that of Angola. After having reached it, Dick Sand would try to gain, either to the north or to the south, the Portuguese settlements, where his companions could await in safety some opportunity to return to their country. But to effect this return to the coast, should they take the road already passed over? Dick Sand did not think so, and in that he was going to agree with Harris, who had clearly foreseen that circumstances would oblige the young novice to shorten the road. In fact, it would have been difficult, not to say imprudent, to recommence this difficult journey through the forest, which, besides, could only tend to bring them out at the place they had started from. This would also allow Negoro's accomplices to follow an assured track. The only thing they could do was to cross a river, without leaving any traces, and later on to descend its course. At the same time, there was less to fear from an attack by animals, which by a happy chance had so far kept at a good distance. Even the animosity of the natives under these circumstances seemed less important. Once embarked on a solid raft, Dick Sand and his companions, being well armed, would be in the best condition to defend themselves. The whole thing was to find the river. It must be added that, given the actual state of Mrs. Weldon and her little Jack, this mode of traveling would be the most suitable. Arms would not fail to carry the sick child. Lacking Harris's horse, they could even make a litter of branches, on which Mrs. Weldon could be borne. But this would require 2 men out of 5, and Dick Sand wished, with good reason, that all his companions might be free in their movements in case of a sudden attack. And then, in descending the current of a river, the young novice would find himself in his element. The question now was whether a navigable stream of water existed in the neighborhood. Dick Sand thought it probable, and for this reason. The river which emptied into the Atlantic at the place where the Pilgrim had stranded could not ascend much to the north, nor much to the east of the province, because a chain of mountains quite close to them, those which they had mistaken for the Cordilleras, shut in the horizon on these 2 sides. Then, either the river descended from these heights, or it made a bend toward the south, and, in these 2 cases, Dick Sand could not take long to find the course. Perhaps, even before reaching the river, for it had a right to this qualification, being a direct tributary of the ocean, one of its affluents would be met with which would suffice for the transport of the little party. At any rate, a stream of some sort could not be far away. In fact, during the last miles of the journey, the nature of the earth had been modified. The declivities diminished and became damp. Here and there ran narrow streams, which indicated that the subsoil enclosed everywhere a watery network. During the last day's march, the caravan had kept along one of these rivulets, whose waters, reddened with oxide of iron, eat away its steep, worn banks. To find it again could not take long or be very difficult. Evidently, they could not descend its impetuous course, but it would be easy to follow it to its junction with a more considerable, possibly a navigable, affluent. Such was the very simple plan which Dick Sand determined upon, after having conferred with old Tom. Day came, all their companions gradually awoke. Mrs. Weldon placed little Jack in Nan's arms. The child was drowsy and faded-looking during the intermittent periods and was sad to see. Mrs. Weldon approached Dick Sand. "Dick," she asked after a steady glance, "where is Harris? I do not perceive him." The young novice thought that, while letting his companions believe that they were treading on the soil of Bolivia, it would not do to hide from them the Americans' treason. So he said, without hesitation, "Harris is no longer here." "Has he then gone ahead?" asked Mrs. Weldon. "He has fled, Mrs. Weldon," replied Dick Sand. "This Harris is a traitor, and it is according to Negoro's plan that he led us this far." "For what motive?" quickly asked Mrs. Weldon. "I do not know," replied Dick Sand, "but what I do know is that we must return without delay to the coast." "That man, a traitor?" repeated Mrs. Weldon. "I had a presentiment of it, and you think, Dick, that he is in league with Negoro?" "That may be, Mrs. Weldon. The wretch is on our track. Chance has brought these two scoundrels together, and I hope that they will not be separated when I find them again," said Hercules. "I will break the head of one against the other's head," added the giant, holding out his formidable fists. "But my child," cried Mrs. Weldon, "the care that I hope to find for him at the farm of San Felis." "Jack will get well," said old Tom, "when he approaches the more healthy part of the coast." "Dick," remarked Mrs. Weldon, "you are sure that this Harris has betrayed us?"